Hello and welcome to Child Welfare, Lecture 11, covering forensic interviewing. So to begin with, one of the things that I think by now you're probably well aware of if you haven't already in our discussions about the Penn State case is this idea that, that not really an idea, but more of a fact that there is a great deal of denial when it comes to abuse. Uh, Denial on the part of the victim, denial on the part of the abuser, and that sort of degree of denial can spread to larger institutions, families. Um, I think at times it's so abhorrent that we try to push it out of our memories, that we try to disconnect ourselves from it. In fact, sometimes we would blame the victim by assigning pathology to the victim and not to the context that brought them to help. In some of the previous theories of psychoanalysis, you can see this. For example, Freud's seduction theory. Now, what's interesting, there's this wonderful text by Jeffrey Mason, and it's one of the he's one of the people that in the unit you'll hear a little interview from, and he was a very interesting character in terms of what he was allowed to do, and then what he did do. So I'll tell you about that the next slide, but just to kind of think about this. So Freud's seduction theory stated that neurosis was due to repressed memories of an early childhood sexual abuse. Initially, he thought that the emotional turmoil was due to the abuse, but within a few years, he changed his course and thought that these memories were in fact merely fantasies, and convinced his clientele that that's indeed what they were. Um, Now, it's interesting when we start talking about Jeffrey Mason and what that means. Now, Jeffrey Mason, the interesting thing about him is he was really an up and coming rising star of the psychoanalytic community. He was given carte blanche to go into Freud's home and find all his documentation and catalog it, put it into an organized library system, and he read through all this sort of all the stuff, um, and translated his work. And it was real interesting because essentially he was there all the time while Anna Freud was still living in the home, and so they would have these interesting interactions. And he would find notes like hidden in cupboards and hidden in desk drawers, and so he would compile all these things. And after reviewing all of these records, and he lays this out in this text that he wrote about it, he came to the conclusion that Freud changed his mind and denied actual sexual abuse of his clients. Now, part of the reason for that was because the clients that he was treating, um, they were the daughters of, and largely they were daughters, female, of people who were paying his bill. And he was a young, up and coming um, professional in the field and was making connections. And as he's finding this stuff out, I think really what happened and what Jeffrey talks about in his book, um, I don't really, the degree of denial on Freud's part, plus his sort of preserving his professional career, he shifted his theory that neuroses stemmed from childhood sexual abuse, and more that it was a repressed memory of sexual abuse. So now we have the beginnings of what we would term denial, right? Now, as we get into this idea of forensic interviewing, there is a difference between forensic interviewing and counseling or psychotherapy. And we'll review what the differences are and also the similarities because, of course, there are some similarities, and I think it would be easy if you were trained as a therapist to sort of fall into the role of the therapist rather than the role as the interviewer. So, how are these things different? Well, in therapy, the difference is you're assuming that your client is telling you the truth. It's less about fact finding. There is fact finding involved, but you're not trying to whittle away necessarily what the truth is. The truth is what's being told to you. Um, Additionally, you become the advocate for your client. You're looking out in their best interest, um, and that is sort of that's the purpose of the treatment, trying to make sure that they have the sort of tools that they need in place to move forward. Whereas in forensic interviewing, you're neutral. You're not pro your client and you're not against the client. Your job is to collect the information, period. As a therapist, you're accepting the subjective reality of the client, meaning the truth of your client, although it may be different from the truth of the client's parents or the truth that the school tells you, you're accepting that truth from your client. As a forensic interviewer, you're looking at alternative explanations, and you're trying to determine, based on those sorts of things, the facts in the case from multiple sources. Additionally, as a therapist, um, you don't need to know every single detail of abuse. You know, you'll hear the story, you'll know what's going on, and it's not something that needs to be repeated or gone into extreme detail. Whereas in forensic interviewing, that's exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to find out all the details because you are going to be presenting either a document for court or appearing in court to present this information. Additionally, in therapy, the way the information obtained is not as important. So perhaps you'll have the child draw pictures, you'll talk to the child, you'll talk to the parents, you'll talk to the school. It's not so important. You're not trying to make sure that every period is dotted in whatever stories you're told. Whereas in forensic interviewing, you really have to be very clear about how your information is obtained, and it's strictly governed because it is admitted into the purpose is to bring it before a court to determine what needs to happen legally at that point. So with forensic interviewing, one of the interesting things is in the 1980s, courts began to allow children to provide testimony without any supporting evidence, and that comes out of Federal Rule of Evidence 601, presuming that all witnesses were competent, as opposed to having them be assessed and to determine if they're competent in these sort of reportings. Also, that 601, it used to be that information was limited to an age of latency or early adolescence. But we know in cases of abuse, it's not restricted to older kids. It happens to younger kids too. So 601 also eliminated, part of what it did in eliminating the competency requirement is it allowed for that sort of material from little kids to be admitted as well. Sorry, this is you'll see this video in the unit. Sorry about that. Okay. Spontaneous accounts are said to be the most credible accounts. They are fresh as they haven't been asked multiple questions. Asking the same question over and over again or in different ways can taint the material. The time between the event and disclosure is also significant in terms of accuracy. So the sooner the disclosure from the event, the better. And also, what's really important is how the questions are asked and answered. Using open-ended, unbiased questions are really key to the whole process. Now, it's critically important, these types of questions that you should try to avoid in forensic interviews. Leading questions, the questions that sort of assume their own answer. For example, if a client's beginning to tell you about abuse and you automatically say, so, how many times did Mr. James touch you? And the fact is, with that question, you're already assuming that Mr. James is the perpetrator. And so you should leave that sort of information out and make it more of a clear-cut response kind of question. Suggestive questions. These are when there are methods or material that directly or indirectly influence or imply something that a child says. Suggestive coercion. These are statements that may prompt or coerce or bribe a child to address a particular topic. This sort of thing also has happened in clinical interviewing, and I think of some kids. This was in I want to say the 80s, in Skokie, Illinois, on an inpatient unit for dissociative disorders. Basically implied their family was part of a cult that murdered people and children, and they drank the blood of others and animals and all this stuff. And what it came down to was that the therapist, every time the child would say something that had to do with what the therapists were looking for, so a bias, they would get a sticker. And so the kids were answering questions in ways that the therapist wanted to hear, the information the therapists were trying to get, rather than the facts. Also, reinforcement questions. These are any type of behavior that encourages disclosure, showing emotional support or approval of the child's statement. Nodding your head, saying yes, yes, yes. The tone of your voice that sounds sort of praising or thankful or appealing. Other types of questions to avoid: contaminated questions. So this is a term that refers to information, ideas, or details about a case where the information comes from someone other than the child being interviewed. So it's information the child doesn't necessarily have, but you're introducing it into the interview. And this is a nice little example here. The interviewer tells the child something that a mother or a witness has said, or refers to some form of evidence that has not previously been volunteered by the child. So, frequent sources of potential contamination, of course, information between parents, the therapist. Joint interviewing does that. Social contact among the victims, they change their stories or add information. Media contamination, watching TV, reading things in the news, as well as other types of therapeutic interventions. Sometimes we've come to understand that hypnosis is not always the best approach to treatment when it comes to these cases of sexual abuse and trying to uncover repressed memories. So, here's the question. Which is the correct way of asking? The first one is, did Miss Helen hit you while you were at school? The second, has Miss Helen hit you before? The third, where were the other children when this happened? The fourth, did she touch your private area? The fifth, did anyone else see? Is it the first one, second one, third one, fourth one, fifth one? Did you make your guess? Say it out loud so I can hear you. That's a joke. Anyway, the answer is the third one. Where were the other children when this happened? Now, why is this correct? Well, in part, you're not talking about Miss Helen. You're not contaminating the question. You're asking something very specific, something both open but to the point. It's not a yes/no question. It wasn't contaminated. And it wasn't one of these close-ended questions. Other things related to inaccurate testimony is what we call suggestibility. And I've got a video in there that talks a little bit, that shows you what suggestibility is. You can see this in hypnosis. In fact, that's really the linchpin of hypnosis, is if you are suggestible, then you can be hypnotized. I took a training in hypnosis years ago when I first started working. It was a week-long, 40-hour training. And part of the training was to go through a hypnotic induction. And what I learned in that process was there were some people in the room who could be hypnotized and some who could not, largely because those people who could be hypnotized were more suggestible, and those who could not be were more defended, is what they call it. I am much more defended than some of my classmates at the time. Did not go under. I felt really relaxed and chilled out, but I did not go under. I was just looking around the room, watching everybody else do silly things. Um, we know that kids are more suggestible than adults, and there's some good research out there if you read uh, the text. For example, the clown study, there were pairs of kids from 4 to 7 years old. They were sent into a trailer where one interacts with the clown while the other kid watches, and afterwards, then the kids are asked leading questions. Not one of the kids who interacted with the clown made a false report. Only one of the bystander kids made a false report of abuse, spanking. Um, on average, a child in an investigation may be interviewed 11 times on average. So that means we're talking less and more. So what that means is they're getting repeated questions over and over and over again. So it's certainly um, likely that they're going to add, filter, or change their story in some way based on how the questions are asked, who asks them, the manner in which they ask, and all that sort of stuff. The mousetrap study. So following up on the first study, um, this is this Chechi, Loftus, Leichman, and Brook. They decided to change one major parameter of their research. So instead of just asking the children if they remember experiencing a fictional event, they told the children that the fictional event actually did happen and asked them to create a visual picture of it in their head and to tell us if they remember it. Children ages 3 to 6 were interviewed 12 times for approximately 30 minutes. Each interview was separated by approximately 1 week. The children were told they were playing a game called Picture in the Head. Children were given a list of real and fictional events. The interviewer lied to the children by telling them that all the events really happened to the child. The children were told to think really hard about the events and to try to make a picture of it in your head. In the 12th interview session, the children met with a new interviewer who explained that the prior interviewer made lots of mistakes and told many of the children that happened to them, which in fact did not. The first session, children assented falsely to a fictitious event 29% of the time. By the 12th session, this figure rose to 43%. So nearly half of the time, the children agreed that this false and fictitious event happened. Younger children obviously were more suggestible than the older children. And then there's the flip side of this. So the mousetrap was revisited. They used 3 to 6 year olds. They used a list of things from the mom, the things that really did happen, and they had 12 interview sessions. The previous interviewer made some mistakes. Some of the things did not happen. And the flip, this happened again, too. The medical exam study. It was a study using hundreds of kids having a medical exam. They used 5 and 7-year-old girls. Half of them had a scoliosis exam, which is, if you're not familiar with that, it's looking to see if the spine is aligned. It's not very intrusive. They have to, usually what they do is they take off your shirt and they kind of line up your spine just to see if it's in a straight line or if it's crooked at all. And half had an external genital exam. Only 3 to 5% of the children ended up making a false report based on some of the questions asked. Interviewers used free recall, anatomical dolls, direct and misleading questions. And they asked questions like, did the doctor put something in your mouth? Did you take your clothes off? How many times did the doctor kiss you? Did the doctor touch you there while pointing to the vagina on the doll? Did the doctor ever touch you before that day? Only 3 to 5% of the children made a false report. 14 to 31% failed to reveal genital touching, those who were getting the external exam. 5-year-olds were more likely to reveal genital contact than 7-year-olds. Children reported twice as much correct information when demonstrating on dolls. So that tells you something too in terms of using anatomically correct dolls. None of the children demonstrated sexually explicit behavior with the dolls. Um, And here's the results that I just kind of read out to you. So that tells you a little bit about what false reporting happens and does not happen when it comes to kids and how suggestible they are. Other things related to inaccurate testimony. Um, Anatomically detailed dolls are used frequently, and most of the people out there who use them have been trained on them. I would tell you this, if you're ever in a position in a career where this is what you would be doing in terms of interviewing, you absolutely must be trained and receive ongoing supervision in the use of anatomically detailed dolls. While I was working with kids. I had a coworker who was leaving the job and going to do something else, and she gave me a bunch of these dolls, and I just thought they were dolls. I put them away. I thought I'd use them at some point for play with kids, and I put them away in my closet. And I don't know, a year or two later, I was going through my closet, and I'm like, oh yes, I remember these, and I realized they were anatomically correct dolls, and I just thought it was so weird and creepy that I got rid of them. Because I didn't even realize what I had in the closet, so it's kind of strange. Other things related to inaccurate testimony are negative stereotypes, and there's some good research in the text that you should check out about this with this Leichman and Chuchi, the Sam Stone study. We'll talk just a minute about the Sam Stone study as well. So, in the Sam Stone study, that's hard to say 5 times fast, researchers tell 3 to 6 year old kids about Sam Stone. They stereotype him as clumsy. He visits the classroom, and the next day, kids are given fictitious evidence. Kids interviewed for 2 minutes once a week for 4 weeks after the visit. They were asked leading questions such as, I wonder if Sam Stone was wearing long pants or short pants when he ripped the book. I wonder if he got the teddy bear dirty on purpose or by accident. Children told 27 lies in the interviews. The first interviews, 25% surmised that Sam Stone did indeed do these things. 10 weeks after the visit, there was a new interview. 46% of 3 to 4 year olds inaccurately recalled that Sam Stone did clumsy things. 30% of 5 to 6 year olds did the same thing. Only 21% of 3 to 4 and under 10% of 5 to 6 year olds made the same claim when challenged by the interviewer. So that tells you some of these things can have lingering effects too, depending on how these questions are asked. Overall, the results indicated that not only do young children form stereotypes, but that information interacts with suggestive questioning to a greater extent for younger than older children. When the context of a child's reporting of an event is free of the strong stereotyping and repeated leading questions that may be introduced by adults, the odds are tilted in favor of factual reporting. So, out of some of this research, some of the things we've learned. Don't tell the children the answer. Don't stereotype the perpetrator. Don't treat any aspect of the interview as a game. Even very young children can lie. You saw that in the research on 3 year olds. Younger children are more suggestible than older children, and the majority of children stuck to their guns. Only a minority made the false reports. You do have to take in some special considerations when you're interviewing immigrant children. There are cultural pieces that come into play as well as language. You have to be very clear on. In fact, it's best if the person who's doing the interview comes from the same cultural background in terms of understanding what's appropriate and not appropriate within the context of the child's culture. There has been some research reviews of forensic interviews, and you can read this is just sort of sort of the Cliff Notes version of the text, which you can read in greater detail about what happened with these interviews. Okay, some of the results of these interviews, you'll hear them kind of referred to as either improper or clumsy. And that basically means, the improper ones have elements of the interview that increase the risk for false allegations, and clumsy ones are flawed interviews that lead to disclosures that are not coherent or convincing. And when you read, or I'm sorry, when you see the video of the case of, oh, what's her name? I think it's Kelly Michaels. It's really astonishing. There are uh, there are some exchanges of the case from 254 to 257, and plus I have some video on the unit about it, and it's really astonishing the sort of stuff that can come out of and what the outcomes can be if interviews are not conducted in a appropriate and professional manner. So, recommendations for good interviews. Uh, Interview as soon as possible, of course. You have to take the time to build rapport. Don't just jump in and start asking these questions. Questions, of course, have to be open-ended, and you yourself have to be neutral, not praising and not being negative. Allow the child to review their statement. Um, the other things that are helpful as well is making sure that you speak at the child's developmental level, and be careful where and how you interview, what's around you, what's distracting or not. And lastly, in terms of other recommendations for good interviewing, um, besides establishing rapport and listening carefully, you really have to be attuned to what's happening in the present and not being in your head when you're doing the interview. Make sure that you set up rules around if the child needs to take a break or things like that, what they can do if things get too difficult. Um, and again, kind of covering the same thing again, open-ended questions, non-biased, and anything from broad to specific in terms of the details that you're getting. The next slide is just a sources slide if you are interested in other information.